Perfect. We have waited for some minutes and now we are going to start. Good afternoon to all the participants and welcome to this session. I am Sandra Ligia Gonzalez. I am the Executive Secretary of the Coalition, and this afternoon we are going to have the participation of the Ministry of Health, who is going to share in practice the use of the tool problem tree in the analysis of regulatory impact, supported by the good manufacturing practice in Colombia. We have organized this workshop as a part of the Standards Alliance that we have. It is in this phase 2 and it's supported by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for the Medical Technology Sector. I would like to thank the collaboration of the National Planning Department, the INBIMA, and also the Ministry of Health to have this session happening as it is. And before starting the presentations, as we have done in other situations, let me quickly mention some logistic topics so we can have a productive session, allowing us the opportunity of dialogue and answering to the doubts that you may have in the practical application of the problem tree tool. As you remember, in this format, all the participants have the microphones off to avoid any background noises. I would like to thank you for making your questions in the Q&A space that you have on Zoom, so we can answer to the questions, and so we can register all of the questions at the end of the session. And without any further ado, I would like to call Oscar Artur Marin and his team, who are going to share the presentation and their experience today. Oscar, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Once again, we are here in this space, and the idea is to tell you very briefly what have been these past 2 years of work when we have built the good regulatory and manufacturing practices. As I mentioned, it has been a long process, and we have the pandemic and of course the things that happened in this aspect, but this work has had many activities and it has been an interesting experience. It is a work of constant learning, and we keep working to consider the following situations and making better decisions in terms of our GMPs. And so we're going to start by saying what is an RIA for the good manufacturing practices for medical devices. So first of all, we are going to define how we built the problem tree, and from that, how it changed our vision in terms of the conditions to build this document, having in consideration what happened last year and over the past 2 years actually. And I'm going to conclude with the experience of the past 2 years. So I'm going to have André Garcia, the engineer, that is going to help us with this presentation today. And she has been ahead of the development of all these documents, and in the ministry we have had her in our team. So André, the floor is yours. Thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. Let's start with the content that we have. And Oscar mentioned the analysis of regulatory impact for good manufacturing practice of medical devices. We'll have here then some antecedents and the assumptions. So The antecedents of these good manufacturing practices are focused on making it clear for the medical device sector about what the requirements they should meet, as well as the IVD reagents. So when we look at medical devices, we are going to refer to the MDs and IVD reagents because worldwide both are considered medical device. Some legislation is different, but I want to make it clear that when we're talking about devices, we are talking about both of them. So it's important to make clear the requirements the manufacturers of medical devices have to meet, and based on the decree 4725, we have the guidelines for the sector. It has been some 16 years since the decree, so this is one of the motivations for our work here to review the decree. We also have some international movements that are important, like the OECD, the Aliança del Pacífico, and others that require us to improve our requirements and the activities we carry out to improve the quality of the medical devices in the country and the attention to patients. Another international movement, as I mentioned, the Aliança del Pacífico, the Pacific Alliance, and international scenarios that bring and establish some agreements of practical relationship between the medical device manufacturers to recognize and agree with some other aspects and be in compliance with agreements, because requirements sometimes are just for just one country and not shared. On the other hand, we now have more knowledge about good regulatory practices and exercises, like everything we do and the regular way we work to understand regulations and what I want to regulate in terms of medical devices and all that. It requires a multifactorial analysis to understand the best alternatives and solutions for any issues related to these regulations. Besides, we understand that the good manufacturing practices are technical requirements, so they require the RIAs according to Decree 1595 of 2015. And later on, we have the Decree from 2020, 1468, and it says that it requires a complete RIA for the good manufacturing practices for medical devices to establish the problematic and the best solutions that we may have for whatever we may have considered as an issue in the sectors. And with these antecedents, we have our assumptions. So we always work, first of all, with a multidisciplinary working team with the technical and legal departments involved. So we have a very nice group of professionals from different disciplines like physicians, experts in medical physics, and others that are experts in the manufacturing of medical devices, as well as nurses that are collaborating and sharing a little more in this regulatory analysis, regulatory impact analysis exercise. And we look for finding and analyzing information to build this RIA. It has a lot to do with the collection of evidence. so we can have figures and data to support any affirmations that we may have regarding regulatory impact. And likewise, we understand that the regulatory impact analysis is a participative process, and we don't want to have a ministry just legislating, but rather having the participation of all the stakeholders, the ones that are going to benefit or affected by the regulation. That's why later on we're going to talk about the exercises we carry out. Also, it's important to have critical thinking and not considering assumptions, no suppositions, and so being really focused on evidence. Because during a regulatory analysis, impact analysis, we have to believe in evidence in order to support and consider what to do in terms of the problem. And of course, think outside the box, which is what we consider as something interesting, because we don't we must think ahead of what things are and think in an unconventional way from different perspectives. This is a way for us to reach more real solutions that may impact more stakeholders. So these are our assumptions, and with those and the antecedents, we have 7 steps in our regulatory impact analysis, and we are reaching the first one, which is the step where you identify very clearly the problem you want to solve. You present the evidence in its magnitude and its reach. So in this step of the regulatory impact analysis, we are going to focus on what we are doing today. That's why we reach our second topic, which is the problem tree that we call the theory to practice, because there is a lot of theory, and the greatest challenge we have in this kind of impact analysis exercise is what we see in documents and books, and how can we bring all that to our real problem. So how do we apply it in practice? So in theory, what we have is a whole course of regulatory improvement and regulatory impact analysis. We have received our certificate, and besides the certificate, we have read the guidelines that were published, and we are reading the most recent one about the best practice for regulatory impact analysis. And once you have all this information, you can say, okay, now I can work with a problem tree. And then what we're going to see is that, and it's one of the challenges I call the attention to, that is that we have to consider the theory in practice, and there is a very hard path for us to walk. So the first thing we did when we considered the impact analysis was to consider the context of the topic we are talking about. And the context of the good manufacturing practices allowed us to see the guidelines of the WHO in the US, what is their regulation, what is going on in Mexico, and the same what is going on in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So what are the regulations? And at the same level, we have ISO 13485, which has to do with the alignments and international alliances that gives us an overview of what's going on right now. Likewise, we have to analyze the market for medical devices in Colombia. So what are the the places that sell, so which one are national, which ones are imported. So we have 87% of them being from importers and 13% working with national products. We also have the same for in vitro diagnosis reagents, and we also have the sanitary registration to understand the number of products that are important, the ones that are national, and the distribution by risk, which is one of the classifications we have for those medical devices. Also, we have the analysis like this one talking about the national production of medical devices and the kind of sanitary registrations we have related to the risk classification that we have. And all that information that we have seen allowed us to analyze the technovigilance reports to understand the causes related to medical device manufacturing, to understand the context and the problem, and what has to do with the practice of medical device manufacturing. And then we made an internal exercise inside our team, and then we had an expanded team because now we are working with the regulatory impact analysis, so we had to carry out in this way. And then we had some worldwide concepts in terms of some key words related to the medical device. So the scheme, the quality, the products, the risk, and some concepts that we had to use based on what has been investigated before, and we entered the product itself, so the internal surrounding and the international surrounding. And we had at the end of this exercise some lines, and the problem was the first exercise in 2019, and we had just finished the regulatory impact analysis. And with all this scheme, this exercise we carried out, we said, okay, let's go to the next level. And so we involved the stakeholders. In 2019, we started working with the practice of meetings, 38 people from different entities, manufacturers, people that work with the sanitary registration, and so we were able to have people that are really going to receive the benefits that as regulators we can provide to them. And with that, we had a workshop that I would call a workshop with a lot of information. We organized the work. So in working groups, we had different entities. We wanted to have someone from the government and working with a manufacturer and one of the people that work with the registration. And in this case, we would have not only the vision of one manufacturer, but one shared with the ones that have the national stakeholders, the government, and so we reached 7 different problem trees, and so we have like our own wood with 7 trees, and so with their own handwritings they built this problem tree. They understood the root causes the trees had, and so we had similar problems that were in connection, but some of them were very broad, very wide, little specific. So the exercise took maybe 3 hours, but was just one first contact, but it was still a little far from what we needed. We had common causes There are similarities with what is proposed by this exercise, and there was a need to continue with the work that was being carried out as a team. After the exercise with the stakeholders that we have organized, so we did the exercise inside the direction, and we had our step 4, which is the problem tree of 2019, and we thought we were concluding the first step. We had a problem, which was the lack of alignment of manufacturing harmonized internationally to ensure a level of quality for MDs and IVDRs. And so we understood we were ready for the next step, but we also needed the validation with other stakeholders like the National Planning Department. And so at that time, we were going with this ministry that was working for ensure and understand the problem related to medical devices and IVDRs to define policies. So we had a lot of information that had changed. And so it with all these stakeholders, we could improve or synthesize this exercise we were carrying out. And these results were reached in February 2020 when we had the validation with the GMP and IETS with 4 causes and 2 consequences in a tree that we were ready to present. We had the opportunity of publishing it, but at that time, COVID-19 arrived in March 2020 and it changed everything. It also changed the perspective that we had for medical devices. And what we have now is our third point, which is a post-pandemic problem tree. The pandemic brought learnings to all of us in terms of our health system, and some of them impacted our work with the problem tree. COVID requires a change in the conditions that generate the capacity of the state of response to emergencies. Because both technologies, medical devices, and reagents have to contribute with the resilience of the system and the strengthening of the health system, because when there is an emergency, it can continue position itself in an adequate way at the same time providing the response to emergencies. I think it's one of the constants that our manager has implemented in all the work, the resilience of the system. So this is an important point that changes the vision of the problem that we had at that moment, and we can say it enriches the work we were doing regarding medical devices, because at this moment we understand COVID increases the visibility of medical devices worldwide, and everything we needed, like the ventilators we needed in great quantities, and the whole problem that the pandemic has brought light to the need of having medical devices available and being prioritary in the attention to health. Additionally, there was a high demand for these medical devices, and it evidences and it shows the problems of supplying the countries and shows the importance of good manufacturing practices. And when all of this comes up, and every day at home when I open a mask to go to the doctor and I have some like the band that is loose, it's an evidence that we do need good manufacturing practices to improve the quality of medical devices and its manufacturing. And something really important is that it delays the analysis of the regulatory impact for This is good manufacturing practice for medical devices. So we had to retain the work to meet the sanitary emergency. And it's important to see how the sequence happens. So we have 2 years since August 2019 when the Ministry of Work has defined the need for assessing the good manufacturing practice, but we couldn't go further because we had at least 6 months without going further, just learning. And after learning, we have the second version of our problem tree in October in 2020 when we could go back to some activities we were carrying out, and between October and December we worked in parallel the information. And then the information on in December 2020, what we had is that it was pending the review of the Vice Ministry of Health of the publication according to Decree 1468 of 2020. And so we couldn't publish our problem for 5 days. So the ministry does so because that is how we ended the meeting. And what we considered is that we have low levels in the requirements to ensure the manufacturing. And so that was the change we made in the problem. And finally, in February 2021, we have another version of the problem tree where we have a new problem, which is low level of requirements to ensure the manufacturing of medical devices and in vitro diagnosis reagents with quality. So this was the problem we had in February 21. And what we needed, the review of the director, and we know that this is part of the practice, and we have this new methodology to develop. So the guideline is that the GMP is going to help us to review each of our advances. And now with the director, we had some meetings and discussions regarding this problem tree. And now the problem changes to the probability that the manufacturing practice may affect the quality, effectiveness, and safety of the medical devices and IVD reagents existing in the Colombian markets, impacting the health of the population. So this is finally the document that we sent to the National Planning Department in 2021. And something very important is that all the information that we collect is condensated in the general document where you had all the information of the evidence. And when we said we could publish the problem, we thought it was just that, and we sent that to the National Planning Department, and that department told us that you have to write the problem as is, not just the tree. The tree is a scheme that supports this development, so we had to go back, and then in this moment, in May, a group of medications is one group of the directors start to develop an impact analysis as well and invite us to help us in these activities, and then they invite us to see how the methodology works, and then we start to understand a lot of things that in the last period we hadn't figured out yet, such as how you describe a problem, how you report a problem, what are the causes, what are the circumstances and the context, and what will and will not be part of the problem. And with all that information, the comments they make, we were able to get in July this year the document that is more broad, with a more common language that we believe today, and it has been sent to the National Planning Department some weeks ago, maybe 1 week, and we believe it has a better form and more knowledge, more information in this problem tree. And today the problem is the difficulty to ensure the safety, effectiveness, and quality associated to the manufacturing of medical devices and IVD reagents. So we have two main root causes and other sub-causes, three consequences, and eight other consequences, deriving consequences. What is important here is that every time we start by building maybe 4 or 5 causes and we start to write the causes of a problem, we understand that we're going to repeat the same we have said before, and so we sum these ideas. And the exercise was interesting because describing things in short words in a little box, since we are used to writing documents of many pages, is a challenge that we have faced, and we have learned with that in this problem tree exercise. So now we have a document that's being reviewed by the National Planning Department, and now we have the first step of the 7 that are part of the regulatory impact analysis, and we have learned a lot of things on the way that we would like to share as conclusions of the experience that we've had in the past years as professionals working in this topic. So I'll allow myself to tell you the 3 first ones. The first one is that from theory to practice, there is a long way, and it's advisable that the entities rely on the support of experts to make the process easier while they build their institutional capacities. We are going to tell you here as an example that as observers of the process for medications, we have seen them build their problem tree for a regulatory analysis and regulatory impact analysis. We can say that today it's much easier for us to build a problem tree after having seen several exercises, participated in some of them, and today we are working on a document of a particular topic, and in this document we reviewed the problem tree. It was easier, it was more seamless, and so a work of months was reduced to some days. And so the process of building the institutional capacities and strengthening them is so important. And so the support of experts can really help by understanding the methodology and guide our steps. The second learning or conclusion that seems very interesting to me is that the situation and the politically correct way of express yourself can influence the process. So when we have the review of the Vice Ministry, as technicians we can say in something in a more technical or punctual way, and after the review we decided to use a more common way, but sometimes it's not the adequate way of saying so. So I believe it's important to have in mind the proper way of expressing this kind of problems, specifically when these are problems that affect so many stakeholders. And the third one is that we have to keep working with the RIAs for the GMPs for medical devices, implementing the learnings of other exercises, and knowing that having a best regulatory alternative for the problem that we have today is what we expect. And I believe we have done so because we understand that what I have as resolution is not going to be what I technically consider what is best for the country, but the best alternative of solution a problem may have. This topic particularly has a lot of alternatives, a lot of possible solutions. You can use an international standard, what you have as requirements for this country, what is specifically for another country or specifically for Colombia, or just an adaptation. And this kind of possible solution cannot be implemented in a country because it can be applied by considering who shouts louder during a meeting. So we have to consider cost and benefits. You have to consider the alternatives to understand what is best for the country that presents more benefits than risks for the regulated parties and the patients at the end. And the following conclusions I will leave to Oscar Marin for him to end our part of the presentation. Thank you. You're muted. Oscar? Sorry. So you were mentioning, and we have seen a series of activities and things we have realized around this regulatory impact analysis. And by following this methodology, we realized that these situations are complex, are large, and by describing them in a sentence, it does two things. We can do it in a general way without getting into details, but when you analyze the points, you can see situations that are similar, are connected to this one, and is part of a problem, but not necessarily are something that we can approach. So when you describe a problem, you consider that things are consequences or causes, but when we see it in practice, it's not as people described it. So when you do it something more described, you see the details and all the points. So going with that and describing it in details requires the possibility of observing causes and consequences, and so this balance creates an amount of positions that is not easy to put in a context right now. And the thing is that the reality has many nuances, and we have so many considerations around the person who is talking about a problem. There is a reality of the national manufacturer, the reality of the registration officer, and the regulators. There is, of course, the reality of the one operating the standards. So trying to connect all these dots has been a very strong exercise, and as Andrea said, we have to think outside our own position as regulators to write the regulation in a concise way and respond to the information we have seen, so it's not something so arbitrary. So the construction of knowledge is always a challenge in a way to get to the good manufacturing practices. So we understand that this feeling of having good manufacturing practices required from us this conscience. Why are we writing a regulation? And who is going to use all that information? And this is something that we are going to have in our work once we are going to have the necessary regulation to respond to the best way to a problem. So it has been a change not only in the professional aspect, but also what it takes to put yourself in this position of what the other thinks, what the manufacturer thinks. So this exercise is interesting. Why does the manufacturer think like that? Why is it a problem? So this is something that is really interesting. The following. And finally, this is an opportunity to talk about the group that we have and we have worked with. And we have some people that are part of this group. But right now, these are the ones working the activity of building the problem tree. So I would like to thank all of you for helping us with this exercise. Thank you, Andrea, Oscar. In a few slides, you summarize dozens of hours of work, and it seemed so simple. And thank you so much for the emphasis you have put in the work behind what means the difference between the first exercise you did, despite having the training, and the last interactions you've had, the most recent ones, then the difference you have seen is the difference that the experience makes. And what Oscar said, this amazing challenge of putting in a few words a problem that is so complex as the good manufacturing practices for our sector, and no doubt any problem that requires the decision of our regulating or not regulating, and if the decision is regulating, how to do so. So congratulations, because the work you've done was hard, but finally you are getting to a position that allows you to focus on the work. And this part is key, because once you have defined the problem the best way, you can define the objectives and then really tackle the problem. All the actions deriving from this is coming from this, which is the inception of all that, because otherwise you can solve the problem or not solve it in the best way in all the senses, because this is the key reason for ensuring safety for patients, of course, but also the commitment of better using the resources of a country. This is a combination that has to be very well balanced, so the final product can really respond to the needs of all the stakeholders. And of course, you can't leave aside the component of the industry, because of course the final result, end result of regulation, can make a huge difference for manufacturers to be able to make available to patients their products or not. And so the answer can be kind of easy, and if we use international standards, the path is simple. If we detach from these international standards, we are going to have challenges, not only for the access, but also for implementing the regulation as is. And considering everything we have learned, and as Andrea remembered in the beginning, the obligations that Colombia has in terms of the international agencies, in terms of good regulatory practices, and the use of international standards in general. And I see Viviana has raised her hand, so Viviana, please. Thank you, Sandra Ligia. So in general, I would like to congratulate only the presentation Andrea and Oscar have just done, because it's a great way of landing everything we have said so far in general terms, in the methodology aspect. But it's a good way of putting it into concrete terms, because everything they say is really uh, show the difficulty of translating theory into practice. And for us, it's clear that conceptually, everything is quite simple. We are not facing any complex topic. The methodology is simple and intuitive. But when we have to lend it to a complex topic like the medical devices matter, in a reality that is so complex as the one the pandemics has presented us, I congratulate you, most of all, because you understood the main part of it, as Oscar said at the end, which is it's not just about organize everything from the perspective of the regulator, because the exercise has value in really putting yourself into the position of listening manufacturers and all the other stakeholders that are valuable for the product, that are important for the problem we are defining. And it is complex. It's very complex, and the system is much wider. So I would like to congratulate you. You were able to translate the difficulties we can observe throughout the way, and you know now that it is important, but sometimes we don't have a possibility of really dimension it in the beginning, and you may feel a little frustrated. So I would like to say that it's important from the beginning to see that it is a complex problem, because the nature of the problem itself is complex. And so you have to take all the steps, and you have to involve the value groups and see different perspectives from the public perspective, or my perspective as a regulator is not the only one. And I really liked the difference between the first three, when you talk about problem as lack of alignment, and then the last three, you already see a very different definition of problem. So it was no question, it was just a comment to congratulate you, because the work has been very well done, and because you have gone through this topic of seeing all the parties, because the problem is complex, and our point of view as regulators is not the only valid point of view. We have to go beyond that. And as Cesar mentioned, methodologically, what are your impressions about the tree? So just to conclude with a general question, I would like to know at what point you changed how you wrote about the problem, because it has to do with the alignments, as I mentioned in the previous workshop. So when I start analyzing the problem, assuming that what is missing is a decree, I already have a solution, and so there may be some other problems in my panorama. So I would like you to tell us how you reached the conclusion that the first reaction to the central problem wasn't thorough, or how did you transform this view? I believe the point was when we were writing the root causes, because we we went through the process and we said, okay, it's a simple problem, we don't have to worry, we have just to add a regulation. That's all we have to do. And at a certain point, when we started reading all these other parts, we understood that things were not connected. And that's how it happened. So when we started listening to the comments other parties were doing and we did this exercise, it was something really good because we had different understandings on the same problem. And so the exercise we do with the group for medications, medications technology, made us change a lot of things too, because the thing is, we are good at talking about good regulatory practices, but actually we haven't really carried out this holistic view, and it's an important point. Start doing it all the time and doing it more frequently. So I'd like to compliment and thank Viviana for the support of Viviana over the past 2 years. And I believe the change has many reasons, as Oscar said. So first of all, we have the pandemic that has changed us, and we started seeing things differently because of the pandemic. When we started asking this question, why? To reach the root cause, because there is no alignment, so that's it. But no, the alignment's not the problem. So this was the exercise that we did to understand the problem. So we had 3 engineers, so we are good at identifying problems and solving them. So we tried to do it our way with 3 engineers and a lawyer. We tried to say why that happens, and then we started having things more clearly to understand the consequences and then define what does it generate. And with that kind of question, it made it easier for us. We know that maybe in 2 years we are going to see other problem trees, or we can go to public consultation, but I believe, and everything is said in the courses of the lack of regulation not being the problem. But when you have a person that works for years with regulations and has to change the way of thinking, that's where you have a shock in the kind of exercise. I would believe, and the invitation would be for to having experts to help us on the way, because the path may be frustrating, but we are getting better, and of course we can work with that. But I do believe it requires follow-up. So we have around 100 people that support us in this group. I'm going to record this piece and I will let everyone know. Of course, we miss something, some things. So it's important to change the people who are working, people that are writing regulations all the time, and see things as established and believe they always have the answer. And changing this mindset is difficult. And of course, we are all very young, and we are finding out how to convert what we know into words. So in the methodological and the good manufacturing regulatory practices, we have to convert it into all the sectors, and we make philosophical questions. And it's important because if we do this kind of requirement for the technical regulations, we should broaden these aspects of RIA for other segments, maybe because these analyses can be used in other regulations as well. And then many things come up. There is resistance from different stakeholders for these good practices to be used more in a way, because sometimes people think they are going to have less autonomy. So changing the mindset is about the problems, and about doing the work is not easy, but it's important. And we are aware that we are all learning and we are new to the topic. So this is the difficulty, the challenge, but also the satisfaction when you get, for instance, the tree that we have. So first you start with the topic of alignment, and then you are expressing it in terms of quality and why am I doing it? What's the quality of what I'm doing? Of course, it has to do with alignment at the end, but why am I doing this? Quality is the main problem. This is the main reason of everything. So it's a beautiful work, and so we can keep going now, Sandra. Thank you, Viviana. Cesar, you have risen your hands. It's good that it's virtually, otherwise you would be tired of your hand raising so long. And yes, some comments were already done, but first of all, in this exercise, I believe the main thing was the will, which is something you can't get in all activities, and in our market it's important to have so, because we have experienced years of doing things the way we do it. And as all changes, we are going to have difficulties, but I think this is the main part. The exercise has the quality, and so it shows the will of learning and really absorbing the knowledge. And of course, you don't have to add a good grade like a teacher does in the end of the document, but when you go through a review, you see what the changes do and how important they are. And one of the aspects I would like to highlight is the use of the language, and soften the language is something we have to do in a way that this exercise of participation should be accessible to anyone who would like so, to pharmaceutical companies and any other party. And I believe that someone else that would like to participate, that would like to give an opinion, they should be able to give an opinion about maybe the masks, and why not? So you can have artisanal producers, manufacturers, and we can see that some part of people had to use other devices in this aspect, because it, we knew there was a problem with access. So we have to facilitate, to flexibilize this language, because it's a participative process for everyone to be able to give their opinion, to learn. And what we are doing is regulation, which of course can be a barrier, but it has to be in conjunction with everyone that sees the need to participate, and you have covered with your observations all the learnings. The second part is, yes, we know the exercise has been long. 2 years of exercise is not simple, but as you said, We know that any transaction and transition is difficult, and you are learning with that. And as Viviana and all of you have mentioned, you know a need of a change of strategy to use pedagogical tools to make the exercise easier, and you showed us that it is necessary to keep following the exercises, giving feedback and follow up, because we have the knowledge, the skills, and we can everyone has the ability of talking, of sharing, of debating. So I believe this is the point that maybe this experience will serve to other entities to start the wheel of using these valuable tools to manage the regulatory impact analysis. And it's not just one more work like, oh, I have to do one more document, but that's it. It allows that kind of space. And the third, we know there is a political risk, and this is a complaint of many parties because the limitation in general in different spaces is to recognize that we failed. We have the right to fail, and it's not a sin. It's not the end of the world. We are finding out the best way. We can learn, we can fix things, we can design things better. And so being open to change, to improve, allows us to have an infrastructure. For instance, for the regulatory impact analysis, I know there are steps I can improve to really tackle the needs in the context we are trying to do. And the thing is, the regulation has to work. And you mentioned there is a need for technical profile for everyone that help us, but also for the ones that make the decisions to see, of course, I need to have a resolution, technical regulation, and that person has to really enrich the document, and this is one of the main things to do in the exercise. And to conclude, I would like to tell us about the how did the idea of the woods of so many trees, because the methodology is not prescriptive, and I believe this is the capacity of the entities to do. Okay, I don't want to do it with computing tool. I want to listen to everyone, and so this is a moment for innovate and involve the stakeholders. So how can we get a more friendly figure? Because of course what we have is a market need. So how did the idea came up? How did the idea come up? And you can say, okay, did anyone say, oh, I don't want to participate? So how did it work? Once you have such a big problem and you got such a concrete tree at the end, which is the main challenge of the tool. Our first woods came because the ministry and the direction was very aware of the participation of all the stakeholders. And at that moment, the new ones came from sectors where the reality was very different from the one we were defining in here. So we had to listen to everyone. We wanted everyone to participate, but we had several problems. First is that the methodology can be clear when you read it, but when you apply it, it's not so easy. And because all stakeholders didn't have the same knowledge, level of knowledge, sometimes the problems were broad and many of them were focused on alignment. And of course, we had a guideline saying that it wasn't a lack of regulation for the exercise, but we believe it was very important because from then, with these documents, we can go back to the trees and have some empathy to try and understand the problem they were trying to represent and what were the causes. Because in these trees, we put or in a way try to comment in all the causes they were mentioned. And for us, when we started the exercise with Sandra and the whole team on the convergence, we started to think that it should be something like we knew something was missing in the segment, and we thought everyone had the same knowledge while building a problem. And of course, having the same level of knowledge would help with the problem trees that we had in our woods. So it would be easier and they could be more succinct in these trees. And then, of course, there is the exercise of really understanding what the other wanted to say. The exercise was positive, but it would have been more positive if we had the follow-up of methodologists, uh, professionals, because they would help us understand what the others wanted to say. And in this case, we had experts, the industry people that work with the manufacturing and had real problems, and people that produce abroad and have real problems, and people that, for instance, have to return a medical device because when they receive, they have some problem, or in hospitals because the device is not working well. These are the ones that are in the front line. So for us, it was interesting to listen to them. And then after the pandemic, we believe some things are going to maintain the things that we learned during the pandemic, and that's how we built our wood. Thank you, Andrea. And before Marisol, I would like to talk about this question that we received. The follow-up you mentioned is from the industry to review the requirements. The follow-up we mentioned is in terms of methodology on how to landing the theory of the courses and what we saw in the presentations to our real problem that we have to address. And clearly, from the industry, it requires to understand the problem and why it's happening for us to regulate on it. Thank you, Andrea. Now, Marisol. Thank you, Sandra Ligia. Can you listen to me? And I would like to share with you the experience of being a part of this problem tree. We participated and on this process, and as part of the private sector, it was important to be a part. It was very productive, and I believe it enriches the analysis to have a view of the chain, because as Andrea said, we have so many parts and we have the SPS. And so I would really like to highlight the excellent work the ministry did and the methodological initiatives that allow the structuration, a technical, a sustainable structure for the process. And that's a great and favorable change. I would also like to mention that it's true the methodological follow-up would be very interesting. We were part of the roundtable, and the thing is that we received some questions, and while building a question, this is key, how you are going to define the question, because by then you are going to develop everything else. So I believe the exercise, the intention with the methodology follow up with experts would be great to all of us, the ones that are part of the project. So first, I would like to highlight that the methodological structure, this mind opening process, facing a new initiative, facing a new way of doing things is amazing. And that before the pandemic, and now we already have a more conscious view that we need more methodology, more structure to build this collective. And we are going to bring favorable results to consider the general landmark that should be more integral to serve all health systems and not only one of the parties, because this exercise was very favorable, listening to all the stakeholders. And so the methodology for all these parties is key because the success of the process is related to how you make the questions for the problem trees and the conclusions you draw from there. So when you share the conclusion of each table, you can say, okay, I agree with table one or table two, and that was very interesting. Because sometimes seeing the perspective of another agent of the health chain is very, very enriching. Thank you, Marisol, and everyone. It's very interesting because we are talking about a process of change and the nature. Our nature is to resist to change, to maintain our state of being. But the elements you are bringing and the work the National Planning Department has done with developing all the tools and the spaces for capacitation and the efforts you are carrying out as institutions for the person that should be involved in this team to have access to the information and can obtain the information is definitely a key factor to help in this process of change. Understanding why and what for doing things differently helps us assimilate or have less resistance to change. But when we understand in depth, we get to a level of convincing of the benefits, and it's not simple. It's something I say with all the trust and all the certainty that the government in the world as a whole, when they decide to participate on a TBT agreement and commit to implement good regulatory practices or the methodologies in general, I'll say it with all due respect, there is an important disconnection with the quantification of the required resources to operate it with integrity. And not only economic resources to have the people, but also the number of people to do so in each entity of the government, as well as the resources in terms of knowledge, developing the expertise, and not just knowing what to do and how to do it. But as Andrea said, it's not the same the following the instruction and say, okay, it's simple, let's go step 1, 2, and 3. But when you start with step 1 and 2 and 3 and you present because you think it's all right and the expert says, no, we have to back on step 1, it can be frustrating. It's part of a learning process, but it's also part of the resources that are not calculated correctly by the governments, and part of the work we have to do to take those messages to the responsible parties, because at the end, if we don't, we are not we are having a breach of international compliance. And that question becomes very valid to all the exercises that we do. The conclusion is, do I have the capacity of regulating? Because there is an amazing effort to generate a regulation because I'm not ready, because I don't have the resources. And again, do I have the regulation? And as a regulator, am I able to operate all new regulation to ensure the compliance to all its aspects? And so the regulatory impact analysis has calculated the costs to all the stakeholders. And so the qualitative topics that we mentioned is not just what to do and how to do it, but the quality of what I'm delivering in this exercise is enough for the end results to be truly reflective of the reality the regulated sector is going to face, and me as a regulator, what am I going to face when enforcing the regulation? So these are the questions we have to ask ourselves throughout the process, and they are very important. As a government, am I committed to regulating? Do I have the resources to do so as I should do it? And the answer is no. To practically all the countries in the world, regardless of the sector. And I believe that is where it is so important. The new thing of this aspect that came up with the pandemic in terms of reliance and accountability, not, reinvent the wheel by the regulators, because you can use what other regulators did, because it's not that you are not going to add value. In many cases, that's not going to add any value when you have regulations that are in this level of reference to international standards. So there are tools that we have at hand, many of them very recent, to facilitate the process, but all of them have to do with the end product. And they don't solve the first problem. It's what Andrea and Oscar and Cesar and Viviana were saying. The resources that are needed to operate all the processes. So we thank a lot all the will, the availability of all the stakeholders that have participated over the weeks of training and the ones we have ahead to be able to operate and really get into these exercises. And I wish I would to end this intervention with a question to Andrea and Oscar. How many hours per person you have dedicated to this exercise? This is an important point because actually 1 month ago we did an exercise for defining this number of hours. And we started with a simple thing. How much time did we spend in one of the questions? And so the philosophical question, how much time? And another question about the document, how much time? And the aspect of regulation, how many hours? And we've reached a point where there are things that are going to get from, the regulation and the review of the regulation that has already been effective. And we defined a minimum for each person. So the work team that we have and other people that supported us on that. And really, for this exercise specifically, I could support you with a calculation, an average calculation. There are weeks that we dedicate to 4 or 5 meetings of 2 hours with the whole team, and some weeks that right now we have the event and we may get together in the past 2 weeks. We haven't talked about it. So the average, we can say that in the past 2 years, we have dedicated 2 to 4 hours a week for the work, at least 2 to 4 hours per week times how many people involved in the exercise? 4 people. In the first year, we were 7. In the second year, 4 people. Exactly. So this is the topic we can't leave aside. It's clear you're saying, Oscar, it's double the resources you need. And that's considering this moment. And I worry, and I wouldn't be on your shoes, but we can support you with what you did. But if you see the regulatory impact analysis that you have, not even the double resources will be able to tackle that. I'm sorry, but that's my impression after we talk about this, reality impact. All of you are doing an amazing effort, and everything we can do to support you, count on us. But of course, we can facilitate spaces, bringing experts on the subject, but the work itself demands hours from you, from all the parties that are part of it. And so we have to consider the priorities. And I ask that because this exercise for good regulatory practices, now you have to do for the ex post analysis of the 4725 and the other decree. So how many hours are we talking about here? And that demand that we have, we need a projection. So how long do we need to work? How many trainings do we have to take to really work with decrees 4725 and 3770? It's because we are talking about tens of hundreds of hours, and we have to consider from the experience that you have had, we have to consider the time, because the plan has to be realistic and you have to be able to commit to the plan because it's realistic, and at the end we deliver the result we are committed to. Well, now we are getting to the end of our time. Do we have any additional comments? We have read some comments saluting the work of the team. Do you have any other comments? I see she has the mic off. The mic doesn't work. Let's see. Well, it doesn't work. So I'm sure we're going to have other opportunities to listen. And well, they are mentioning in the chat that the session has been very interesting. And Oscar, Cesar, Andrea, Viviana, do you have any final comments? I would like to conclude, Sandra Ligia, that the thing you mentioned about resources from the regulator party and from our part in terms of methodology and alignment, it's important really to say, and as public entity, we have to be creative in the short term, to think on the mid and long terms, to see how we are going to strategize what we're going to do, and we have to be creative after all. And we are generating alignments and courses and guidelines and all the plannings to try and land all the methodology. But we are sure that we need you, for you and for us, to do this follow up on the processes of the entities, because like you, what we can do from the methodology aspect is very interesting. And from everyone, your follow up is, and sorry, your feedback is very important. So we are here learning. with the will of our hearts. So we want to know if things are working in reality. And finally, I'd like to say that the creative part that we can win with this project is that from the documents that we do, like documenting the whole process, can help with other regulators from the sector or from other sectors. And what you said, for instance, about the stakeholders to have some roundtables and putting them together and collecting all that information. Otherwise, we would have just one perspective. That kind of thing, that kind of exercise has to be documented to be a reference for others, because we can provide an alignment from our side, but you as regulators can show how you did it in practice. So this, for the moment, is interesting because you can help with the sector in other alignments for the health sector, for instance. It can be considered for a long term. Thank you, Viviana. Andrea, I would like to conclude with three sentences. The first is that from the theory to practice, there is a long path and it requires follow-up, and because we want it to happen. Second is that the regulatory impact analysis is a topic of the sector, not of the regulator, and it has to be done in a participative way with the point of view of all stakeholders that somehow we have to modulate. And third, that the direction of medication and the Ministry of Health are open to all the new methodologies that we are learning to do things the best way. And we do believe that at the end, it represents benefits to all of us, which is, of course, at any point, we are all going to be patients. Thank you, Andrea. And this last thing you said is really true. Definitely. Thank you. Oscar, any comments? Well, as you see, Andrea has said many good things, and I believe we have seen the ministry really taking on this work, and we are going to have to meet in other spaces. And it's important to take into consideration that when you generate other things, that you consider how to get involved into how you build expertise and who can support you on that. Great. Oscar, thank you, and thank you all. And soon we're going to let you know the next session and the next steps for the exposed evaluation that we have ahead of us. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.